طاب صباحكم جميعا.
Be here. Many thanks to Professor Kamrava for giving me this opportunity, and also thanks to the great team at the Arab Center for organizing this event. So when I submitted the abstract for this conference, the original title was Forward Defense in Crisis, and that was of course before the 12-day war. And now, as you can see, I changed the title to the collapse of the forward defense. So the signs of unraveling of this very notion that shaped Iran's national security doctrine for decades was already apparent since the start of the war in Gaza, and then during 2 rounds of tit-for-tat attacks in April and October 2024 with Israel. But then it was the 12-day war that put on full display the weaknesses and the challenges of the forward defense. So let's start by describing what forward defense was actually about. So, and here I think it's it would be good to kind of clear a common misunderstanding that forward defense is usually considered equal to the use of proxies, or whatever we call it, the axis of resistance. But that was only part of that. So the way I frame it, forward defense has been based, because, as I will say, there's still no new strategy to replace that. So it has been based on 3 main pillars. The first was strategic depth, in the sense of projecting power into regional theaters, such as Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, with the aim of preventing threats from reaching Iranian soil. So, of course, there was always an ideological element to Iran's regional strategy, its policy toward Syria, toward Iraq, and so on. But strictly speaking of the national security and military strategy, which is the focus of this article, this strategic depth was commonly referred to by senior Iranian generals and so on. So there's an abundance of statements regarding this. Maybe the clearest example was the kind of repeated framing when the war in Syria happened, that if we don't fight in Syria, we're going to fight within the Iranian territory in our cities. So that's kind of related to the strategic depth. The second one was what I would call deterrence by delegation. And I hesitate to use the term proxy for all these groups, because they're simply not. It's a range, the network that was defined by Iran itself and its allies in the region as the axis of resistance was actually a hybrid network consisting of proxies, of partners, of allies, with different levels of agency. But overall, deterrence by delegation was another type of it. Again, another pillar of it. Again, it wasn't only about geopolitics, it wasn't only about security. Ideology played a role here, especially in strengthening those very alliances that I mentioned that form the pillar of the network. But here it is about deterrence. And the third pillar was a range of hybrid tools from missiles, drones, and cyber capabilities, which were designed to be supportive of the other main elements. So these 3 were connected. Missiles and drones were transferred to allies in the region. Strategic depth was, of course, preserved by those very actors which were active in those fronts, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, in Syria, direct and an indirect Iranian role, and in Iraq, of course, some of the more pro-Iran elements of the PMF. Anyway, so what these 3 elements have in common was that together they formed a kind of asymmetric way of deterrence. So asymmetry is the key to understanding the forward defense, and that's the theoretical framework or conceptual framework, better to say, that I have used in this article. So asymmetric deterrence, of course, in the sense of allowing weaker states to use indirect tools to deter stronger adversaries. So this connection that I mentioned between these three pillars used as that. But, you know, at the heart of asymmetric deterrence strategy, there are some potential contradictions, and those very contradictions in the end resulted in the unraveling of Iranian strategy. For example, when you rely on proxies, not as a kind of, how to say, contingency plan or whatever, but as part of your national security doctrine, there's always the risk of proxy incoherence. There's always the risk of uncoordinated actions by those groups. So that was one of the reasons. Then we have technological inferiority on the Iranian side, especially in light of changing nature of warfare. And, you know, it was, again, fully apparent during the 12-day war, the superiority of Israel and the United States in terms of technology. So what technology does is that in some cases, and again, this happened in the Iranian case, it makes, to a good extent, it makes like strategic depth, for example, in terms of geographic buffer, obsolete. Because you built this whole geographical buffer, but in the end, you know, surveillance tactics, I don't know, the fighter jets, advanced fighter jets, and so on, they could penetrate. So as we know, this very tendency to work on asymmetry and to turn asymmetry into doctrine had its roots in the Iran-Iraq war, and then this threat perception that was formed during the 8 years of war with Iraq was somehow consolidated. After 2001 and 2003, the US invasions of Afghanistan and the United States. So in a way, Iran started to face itself kind of, you know, surrounded by a network of US bases or US alliances all around the region. And that's where asymmetry, the sense of asymmetry comes from, and that's where the tendency to work on asymmetric factors come from. But then another challenge that in the end was destructive to the strategy was that what started as a defensive and deterrent strategy after the Arab Spring started to gradually turn into some sort of an expansionist policy. So strategic depth, extending this geography, it became a goal in itself somehow. And so it contradicted in many cases the very notion of deterrence, in the sense that it resulted in a sort of overextension, especially given the shrinking resources at home due to sanctions, economic pressure, and so on. So what happened during the Gaza war, and especially during the 12-day war? So the Gaza war, of course, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that Iran was not aware, at least, of the specifics and timing of the Hamas attack. But what happened afterwards was that this network that Iran had worked a lot to build, the axis of resistance, around the notion of unity of the fronts as a means for a multi-front war against Israel, started to get activated almost immediately, and in different layers. So Hezbollah was the first support front, and then they were backed by the Iraqi militias and the Houthis in the other layer. And Iran was rather confident that, you know, Israel doesn't have the capacity to fight in several fronts at the same time. Of course, it turned out to be wrong. But another misperception that challenged this strategy was that when Iran and Hezbollah, especially these two, because after the killing of Soleimani, Nasrallah played a key role in the Axis. So when they built the so-called joint operations room around the idea of the unity of the fronts, my impression of studying this topic in detail is that they counted a bit too much on institutionalization within the Axis and started to forget about how influential individual figures are within this network. And that was exactly what Israel did as a countermeasure to decapitate the Axis. And after some time, I mean, by targeting the heads of the Axis, from Nasrallah to Abbas Nil Furushan, for example, and the people who were targeted in the Iranian consulate in Damascus and so on, the Axis has started to show signs of incoherence. So that was another problem. Then we had the fall of the Assad regime, which was a serious blow to the notion of strategic depth, of course. It cut the connection between Iraq, the so-called land corridor that Iran was hoping to use, not only as a military corridor, by the way, but also as a geo-economic one in the longer-term perspective. That also fell. And then came the tit-for-tat attacks. And that's where the most serious challenge started to appear, because in deterrence, you always have this dilemma of conceal versus reveal, right? Asymmetry and this kind of hybrid way of kind of defining your national security strategy. Another feature that they had in common was the sort of strategic ambiguity. So even the missiles that Iran had, as I said, so it was supposed to be a complement of the other factors, and it wasn't supposed to be the only way of fighting the adversary. So strategic depth in challenge and the Axis, deterrence by delegation, also showing signs of incoherence. You need to rely on missiles. By relying on missiles, you conceal what you have. And the adversary starts to adapt. They adapted, and they adapted again after October. And that's where we ended up in the situation of the 12-day war. So I will make it very brief because I know that I don't have much time. What happened, the key failures, of course, during the war was first, missile use became compensatory. So the other elements, the other three elements failed. So missile use became, it was a shift, as I said, from the kind of hybrid way to a single-dimensional strategy. Strategic depth eroded not only by the fall of Assad, but also by superior technology. Iran, basically Israeli air power surveillance bypassed Iran's territorial buffers, AI satellite targeting, and so on. This was the second. Third one, as I mentioned, the axis of resistance somehow imploded. Fourth, domestic vulnerabilities were exploited. You know, the depth and scope of Israeli infiltration within the Iranian system couldn't have happened without the economic and social dissatisfaction among the public that made this infiltration. So it wasn't just about technology, it was also about domestic failures, and back to the issue of overextension, as I mentioned. So it backfired at home and backfired drastically. So just to end, as we saw, now all the three main pillars of the forward defense are somehow in question. Strategic depth penetrated and broken. Deterrence by delegation incoherent and fragmented, and hybrid tools became escalatory and insufficient. And basically what we saw is that a deterrence strategy which was based on both deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial is now only based on deterrence by punishment and only partial part of the capacity that they had before the start of the war in Gaza. Thank you for your patience, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much.